What I find funny is I'm looking at this report that I had for this class that I had to do. And some of the research that I dug up, and when I talk about how it's like just old stuff, this one's talking about the views of punishment and how we tie that in. We don't look at policing when it's a punishment of violence that affects the community. Like that violence is completely dismissed as not something that causes trauma in the same way that we are ready to punish violence when another citizen conducts it. And all this stuff is being talked about in the literature, just going like back far and far, talking about how race and gender and class and migration status influence imprisonment, and how different cultures have always had their views of what these classifications are affects their levels of imprisonment of those populations, and that how citizenship affects how we punish migrants who come into our countries. And it's like all these paradigms we look at now and we can observe in front of us. I just keep being baffled by how you can go into the literature and into history and they just constantly repeat themselves over and over and over again with no hope for a ceasing of the cycle.
Do you think that cycle can be undone as long as there is material disparity of a nature that allows some to go more or less completely without, so below subsistence level? Can the cycle be done away with while that is still a possibility?
You mean like a basic income?
Putting aside the issue of how we would address it, as long as there are people who exist below a subsistence level of wealth or earnings, can we do away with this cycle?
I think that's a secondary step, because I keep going on the hypothesis that our salvation is that digital device in our hands and its connection to the greatest collection of information. So I just keep thinking the
collected works of Pink Floyd, right?
Sure. Hey, there's a lot of lessons in there. We discussed earlier about how there is an education in the lyrics that come up, especially since musicians and athletes usually come from oppressed classes. So that's why you
like to pirate music, don't you?
No, I have an Amazon Unlimited subscription now, so we're totally good with that. I'm not saying back in the Napster days things were completely legit, but that's an issue of the past. How do we get on that anyway?
I got us off topic. We're talking about the sort of cycles of violence.
Right, and so that if the information is available, then that's what pushes us out. So that information being in the hands of everybody is what will gather them into the knowledge that you have to uplift the weakest, because uplifting the weakest is truly the way that you lift all boats. So I think that what comes first is the knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be hard pressed to disagree with that. I mean, we have to reach a certain level of understanding in a number of spheres. I think the challenging one is the moral sphere, though, because that's the one where we have the most difficulty agreeing on, right? Like, to the point where we could get there technologically, but not be ready to implement it politically, much the way we're seeing our efforts fall short in terms of addressing climate change, right? It's not that we don't know how or have the technology or have the ability. The politics, essentially the morality, has gotten in the way.
Well, I know it's always going to keep going back to Citizens United, and right before then I forget the ruling before that really kind of kicked it off of legal bribery, but that's...
I don't worry about Citizens United.
Those things...
Liberals got money too.
But the thing is that's a bad methodology. So
I understand.
Then we're judging...
I understand.
Okay, so we have to change the methodology.
But we didn't ask for this.
Right. I get that.
And we control the economic activity of the United States of America.
True. So, I mean,
we
yes,
got money too.
I guess if you could unite
All right, we might not be the Kochs.
Right, but you got to unite everybody around that. You know, but I just saw the Waltons have more money.
But even
than
the right,
42%.
But even the right isn't, like we've just seen with this whole attempt to pass a law that they couldn't iron out in 7.5 years. The right isn't always united. So there are certain individuals who have an incredible amount of spending power.
But those are politicians, though. That's a different argument, because the right and the left, when it comes to politicians, are all right.
But it's also the truth in terms of the activists. They have different causes. The billionaires have different interests. And so they're not always aligned. There might be some issues where there are overlap, but there are others on which there are not.
The business interest is always going to go to the right, though. The ones that aren't that way are bucking the system and having their personal morality overwhelm their business interests.
No, I agree. But there are also institutions and organizations like union organizations, for example, that are also benefiting from a decision like Citizens United, because it takes caps off of what they can do. Things of this nature. You know, I'm just saying that in the overall balance, I think it probably kind of evens out.
Yeah, I don't see it that way. I think the prison industrial complex is still fueling everything that's going on right now. The fight we've had in Standing Rock is directly fueled by those few rich people. It has nothing to do with it.
Those persons haven't disappeared, but that doesn't mean that
their influence is hugely disproportionate.
Yeah, it is today. But
right.
We're also much more aware of that influence today than we were in previous moments, right? Today there's those who talk about boycotting Jordan products because of his support of the prison, the private prison industry. And so, obviously for those of us who care about an issue like this, we're not necessarily where we want to see us. But, progress in these things doesn't happen slowly. Quickly, it happens incredibly slowly. That's just the nature of changing a society.
Sure.
You're moving a big ship, and so you have to accept the slow, incremental, grinding progress of it all, or you're just going to end up in a very unhappy, bitter space.
Or maybe somebody succeeds and blows this bitch up, and
yeah, that's not what we want.
Well, hey, that was the saying, though, that you have to destroy the system,
and that's how you get a Trump. Okay, the system is your grandmother gets her Social Security check, right? That's also the system.
Sure.
Okay, like blowing it up, is it just like oppression ends? It's like, no, like everything ends.
I only want to blow up policing. I don't want to blow up
like
the whole thing.
People got to chill with the whole like turn over everything. It's like, you haven't thought that one through, kid. You're just pissed off still.
True.
Go be pissed off somewhere else, like in a padded room.
Sure, I don't mean blow up the government, but like the system that we have of money influencing the politicians and that actually controlling the outcome, that is the first and foremost influencer that we have right now when it comes to legislative policy.
I don't buy it.
It's been proven, though.
I don't buy it.
Even the NRA has more power than all of the American citizens. The popular vote from American citizens puts in a lot more regulation, especially background checks of even NRA members. But the NRA lobbyists and their money and influence controls the politics more than anything else.
But at some point, people agree with those values. And it's not true that Democrats, for example, have not been able to win in this new system. Barack Obama won under this new system re-election. It's
right, but I don't think they're any different. Obama is no different to me.
I don't agree with that at all. I think that they're incredibly qualitatively different. I do think Hillary Clinton is not the same as Donald Trump, but
not the same as individuals. I think the outcomes of the system result in very similar outcomes.
Because the system is a system. It's not. It doesn't change based on who the leader is. That would be a bad system.
But it changes because of the collective legislation, which is dictated by rich elite people who keep crafting the system more and more to their favor.
No, but it's also that process doesn't happen unless people consent to the values and the ideas that are presented to them by those elites.
Well, the politicians have.
No. The politicians don't put themselves in office. We put them in office.
But money does.
But it's not that simple. We've seen lesser funded, right? If money, wait. If money determined the outcome, Jeb Bush would have won the Republican nomination for president.
It's not a determiner. It's a huge influence.
Okay, but it's hardly, and we've seen this time and time again, that the best funded candidate doesn't always win.
True.
And it's hardly a guarantee of anything.
True, but the system being that it was that way and a preponderance being that way has made it in a democratic republic that the majority rule that is put in policy has done things like keep 75,000 black Michiganders from voting, which did directly influence the election, which is not what we're talking about. Because you disenfranchise voters, because the system does that, you create this self-fueling thing that continues to collect it in ignorant white voters.
Yeah, but I just think that some of that narrative oversimplifies it. And I think part of the problem is that in terms of our two mainstream parties, the Democrats and the Republican, they're broadly operating in the same value system at different poles of it. But persons who
they're not different poles, though.
No, I think they are. The problem is that you are not operating within their system. You're operating within a different system that is built on a criticism of their system. So you see them as the same, but from their point of view, they are nowhere near each other. And I think that most of the country is somewhere in that middle conversation that you're outside of right now. And so for them, it's not to them, it's not, they're the same. And I think that those of us who have kind of stepped outside of this conversation and stepped into a vocabulary that is built on a criticism of that one, we have to acknowledge that we speak for very few people. Most people feel very comfortable in that system. It's where they get their groceries.
Of course they feel
and their prescription drugs.
Yeah.
Okay, but we have to acknowledge then that we're kind of imposing our will when we say the system has to be completely different.
Mm-hmm. Totally. I'm trying to convince you that this will be better for everybody.
Okay, but we could be wrong, right? And at some point, the only thing we get to do is sort of present the idea and try to convince people.
Sure.
But I think we can't adopt a sort of messianic viewpoint of ourselves as sort of like leftists.
I just shed leftist period. Like I just don't. This paradigm is not. It's not relevant. It is. I mean, it's relevant because we constructed it, but it's not objectively the reality. The objective outcomes of our military industrial complex between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are going to be irrelevant.
Yes.
And I care about what the practical reality is that we're dealing with.
But the practical reality isn't whether the military industrial complex still exists or still creates weapons of mass destruction. The practical reality is whether you have a commander-in-chief who tweets foreign policy or you have a commander-in-chief who actually understands how world politics works.
Right. So as long as our face on fascism is friendly, we are okay with it.
Yeah, I think that's another oversimplification. No, it is.
Okay, so already Obama has done more than Trump has militarily.
Well, certainly.
Right. So even in the same time frames, we can take out time frames where Obama has an equal time frame done way more destructive, ridiculous, probably war criminal.
But Obama was never a dovish Democrat.
Definitely not, because he's a moderate. Okay?
Yeah.
He's a Republican 30 years ago.
Yeah, and he's somewhat hawkish on foreign policy. I think that's fair to say.
Sure. But we let all that go and don't talk about it.
I agree. The left is hypocritical.
He was so pretty when he presented it. And now that we see an ugly face on it, it's easy to point out. But what I'm trying to say
is... It's not even that. I think we didn't want to tar the historical moment.
Whatever it was. What I'm trying to tell you is if we would have elected Barack Obama to a third term, which everyone would have united around over Hillary or Trump.
Yeah,
okay, we all would have done that.
Fair.
Okay, so the country would have easily elected him to a third term. And what I'm trying to tell you is that more people that were like me or that were poor, who were being trained to kill and die overseas, would be dying, or just as many terrorists would be created by Barack Obama as they would be by Trump. It's just empirically true.
No, that I disagree with.
I do think you can't disagree with it.
No, I think because the instincts might be different in terms of, right? For example, there were many people who for a long time suggested we needed to ramp up our presence in Afghanistan. And Barack Obama for a long time resisted those efforts, and he left with many people criticizing him for what they perceive to be a failed Afghanistan approach. And so today I think we're seeing a different mentality, and that's going to mean more boots on the ground. And so that is a substantive difference in policy from one administration to the next that has a practical application. Even if the military industrial complex was churning, we still would have had probably less boots on the ground. Now,
but at no point in time has this been true yet. That's what I need to. Everybody's got to understand that. At no point in time has Trump done more to kill our American veterans and service members than Obama has. At no point in time has this been true.
Yeah, but that's Obama was president for 8 years. Donald Trump has been president for...
taking any clip, take any of the same 100-day periods.
But we're still in the first 100-day period of the Trump administration. So you can't. The comparison there, you don't have enough there.
Not yet. But what I'm just trying to say is that everything is conjecture. Empirically, nothing has been an outcome change.
Yeah, but what you're suggesting is that because these things took place under Barack Obama, they couldn't have taken place to a greater degree under a different administration with a different philosophy.
I can never demonstrate that.
I understand, but we do know that different administrations pursue different foreign policies. The foreign policy of the Bush administration was different than the foreign policy of the Obama administration. Sure. And the foreign policy of the Trump administration will be different, and each one will have its own results. And that is the practical application. The question is not going to be, at this point in history, America being what it is, whether or not we are engaged militarily around the world. And I mean, I come from a colonized space, a space that is still colonized, but I do acknowledge that there is this sort of phenomenon of a Pax Americana. It doesn't touch everywhere, but people seem to think that, like, if the American military presence disappeared, it would just be like Canada. It wouldn't. It would be like Syria. And so part of me is like, I just have a practical, to my mind, approach to, like, what is the reality? We might not love everything our country does in the sphere of foreign policy, but this idea that we would, like, dismantle our military just to make a point about colonialism, I don't think is really a realistic view of what the consequences of that would be.
It sounds
we have enemies in the world.
Sounds like a
guys.
lot of but our enemies are self-created. We don't have real enemies. Who do we have?
That's fair, but that's...
Who's the enemy?
But we're talking about people, like real people, not like, super intellectual people who like gonna think above the fray. That's what people do. We create our enemies. You don't have enemies without creating them. So
we got to stop creating our enemies.
I'm just saying, like, when we think about what are, like, the goals and the policies we pursue, they have to be tethered to the carnal reality of who we are as a society still. And we're not high-thinking intellectuals as a whole, right? Somebody comes and says, I'm going to, like, make all those people who hurt you pay. We fucking elect that guy. We're just happy he's angry like we're angry. That's how we think as an animal. So this idea that, like, if we stop being a certain way in the world, that's going to go well. That is not who we are yet. That's not where we are.
Well, I don't know if that's true. We'd have to stop it and try it first. Like, I just feel like everybody knows.
What about the election of Donald Trump suggests to you that people will turn to their better angels?
Because I don't see that as being the hate charged thing. I think it was that the system is so bad and they're so oppressed through capitalism, they just don't know why.
But that won't change when you dismantle all that. That's my point. It's like the trauma doesn't go away overnight.
Right, but those resources we can dedicate to something better. Yeah,
but you have to manage that. And that requires a government that we just dismantled.
Sure. I'm not saying this dude can do that.
No, I'm not saying we can do that as, like, utopians, as leftist utopians.
I think we can.
I don't think we can.
I know people think I'm too simplistic.
Ourselves if we think we can. I think we have to have the humility on both sides in the policy sphere to acknowledge that our ideas are always theories. They might work out according to plan, or we might have made some miscalculations, especially if our like sort of fundamental anthropology is
But
off.
we can be confident when we know we're doing wrong. And
No, that is not a lesson we have learned in history. We are rarely confident that we know when we are doing wrong. We usually justify.
I'm going to give you a good example.
I'm
going to give you the drug war. Okay, we clearly know that's wrong, so we don't have to know the right answer.
Wait.
But if we stop,
you and I know that's wrong because in our value system, that is a truth. Not everybody thinks it's wrong.
Right, but it's a statistical proof. I mean, statistical reality.
Because in our value system, we look to something like statistics. That is not their concern necessarily.
I know, but it's a fact that ending the drug war will lower violent crime.
For them, it's a fact that drug use is immoral and we fight it regardless of what the consequences are because it's principle.
Right.
Okay, you disagree with that, but you see how like the calculations in the two vocabularies are not the same. So you can't. There's no way for you to convince them and them to convince you. You're just operating on a completely different playing field.
But it's empirically true that stopping the drug war.
But only you care about empiricism.
That's fine. But if we stop it, I can be confident that no matter what we do, we will be better than where we are now merely by stopping.
Okay, you live in Pennsylvania.
Yes.
Swing state.
Yes.
Who did you vote for?
Jill Stein.
Okay. And you feel like you couldn't vote for Hillary Clinton because?
Because I think she's going to send as many of my friends to die in needless wars and lock up as many of people of the oppressed classes and people I care about in the cities of our streets through policing.
So if somebody said to you empirically, if we look at just the policy platforms and we let the CBO score them, and it showed that one would do that more than the other, would you still say that it was better to vote for Jill Stein in a state where you know that vote could have impacted the outcome of the election and have Donald Trump as president versus Hillary Clinton? Would you still do the same thing?
I don't accept that version in wording.
I've just suggested to you that I do think that.
But you said as it would help somebody.
No, I'm just saying the outcomes of the two policies just on paper probably would lead to different outcomes.
Sure.
I mean, we would know that simply just on the illegal
so I'm going to vote
front.
for whoever has the best policy.
Okay. But in this case, you voted for someone who didn't really have a chance of becoming president because you felt like morally you could not bring yourself to vote for Hillary Clinton.
No, because morally I'll vote for the best policy. I vote for things, not against things.
That's fair enough.
Right.
But is the perfect the enemy of the good here? This is really off my point. My point is
no, the point's fine. I just continue to think
it's really irrelevant. The point is though, you're not going to move off of your value system in terms of how you determine your candidate. Even if you could have had not the best policy, but a better policy, you will not vote for one that isn't the best to your mind. In the same way, the person who is unwilling to look at the empirical fact because they think of the drug issue as a moral issue, they're not going to move off that value system.
Right, but
so
I'll
can't
move
demand,
depending upon an outcome. If they
based on an empirical outcome, but you won't be swayed by their moral because they're operating on a completely different system. Even with their source of morality.
But if their moral system would then should be to lower the drug use, right?
No, that it doesn't necessarily have to be about an outcome in the system, is my suggestion.
You mean just the fight is what they want to vote for?
It's the principle. You fight this. It's not about the outcome. You don't allow something like this. You send the message that it's immoral. We don't accept this as a society.
So let's fight it. And there's ways of fighting that are smarter.
That's not what they're here for. You see what I've just tried to get you to see, like like you're on parallel tracks that don't crisscross at any point. And so it becomes impossible if the demand is accept my terms for determining your truth, right? Accept my empirical method to determine your truth. It's just, you're not going to accept their moral worldview for the purpose of...
So what's the solution then? Wait for them to die? I mean...
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I've reached a solution. And this is precisely why I don't think you pull away from the fight, but I think you enter the fight with enough humility that maybe you don't know as much. Maybe that fact that you're operating in a value system is an inherent evidence of your finiteness. You're operating within a bubble that kind of determines your outcomes. You probably have difficulty seeing some of the shortcomings, much the way we notice in other people who speak a different vocabulary. And so we have to be aware that, like, yeah, we believe these things strongly. But at this point, we are exercising something akin to faith. We're not exercising something akin to how we like to think of reason. And so we just have to enter with enough humility to say we could be wrong. And so we can't speak in apocalyptic terms, and we don't tear down society because it doesn't reflect our values.
I don't know. I mean, like, the big criticism on science of why they don't believe science is because science always admits it can be wrong. Right? So that's why they say, like, if you go in saying I could be wrong, they won't follow. Because we're not, there's no possibility of being wrong by saying ending the drug war.
Do scientists say that? You know, because I've been in fundamentalist Christian spaces. I used to be one, and I can't say that was the discourse.
That's what I hear as a lot of pushback is that, like, science doesn't have the answers because they'll point to something in history where science was dead wrong, which is an example of how science works because we identify its weaknesses and we can never tell you anything 100% in science.
All right. You ready for this? But isn't that what activists say when they say the system is imperfect, so it must be torn down, right? Because at this point they're saying science has been imperfect. It has reached conclusions that it turned out. And rather than seeing the fact that the system has progressed, they say, so you reject it outright.
Well, science is always different because science has a perpetual model of self-improvement.
Yeah.
Of reevaluation.
No, you see, and you see, this is, I think, a dangerous discourse. And this is what Thomas Kuhn wrote about. I might be wrong on that first name, but you know, he wrote about Kuhn.
It's Thomas.
It is Thomas Kuhn, right? The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And his point is the classical narrative of science is that it kind of progresses over history to a higher plane of knowledge as it goes. But the reality is that science has generally progressed on the basis of paradigm shifts, where the conclusions reached in one paradigm are only possible within the structure of that paradigm. And then when a shift occurs, new conclusions can be reached on the basis of this new paradigm. And so, there are different types of geometry, and they reach different conclusions based on the calculations that operate in each form. And you can't reach the conclusions of one in the other system, but both have real world applications. So neither is wrong, but they're paradigmatic in nature. And so science not progressing in this way, but if it is indeed a function of new paradigms allowing for new types of knowledge and conclusion, then there's nowhere science is supposed to end up. So science will always be shifting, right? So science is not ascending in anywhere in particular. And in the same way, I think society is never shifting in a particular, it's not ascending naturally, which is kind of like another sort of Enlightenment classical view. Really, it's Platonic, frankly. But the idea that we're progressing towards some higher plane is not any more true for society. So we're always shifting in some direction based on new paradigms that introduce new moral valuations.
I would tell Thomas Kuhn he doesn't have enough of a time period to make those conclusions. And I'm sure that sounds audacious for a 37-year-old to tell Thomas Kuhn, but I think that's just without question that human spaces and interactions require a longer distance in that. So my support is
how I do think it's fair to say, as someone who's studied a fair amount of human intellectual history, that it is broadly paradigmatic of other spheres of human knowledge. So like moral thought, political thought.
Pre-age of information, I feel like is pre and post salary cap in the NFL.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
But my point is that human knowledge, broadly speaking, has generally functioned on the basis of these sort of paradigms that allow for certain valuations and then shift into new methods. There's really no reason, unless you agree with the sort of theological view that the human mind is like this inherently rational thing.
It is definitely not.
Exactly. So if you don't believe that, there's just no reason to think the scientific method would operate in a different way than other spheres of human knowledge. That's my point. So,
but I do think it does.
And we can look at the operation of spheres of human knowledge going back quite some time, certainly longer than the internet age or even Copernicus. I don't know, whenever we want to start saying like modern science begins in the West.
Okay, so like we have gotten to this point where the philosophy of philosophy almost seems silly to us. Okay.
I don't know who else is.
Science in general.
Okay. I doubt they understand much philosophy, but
right. But I get what you're saying, that they don't understand it, but we have largely believed it to be not as critical to truth finding.
Because you've adopted a theological worldview without realizing it.
Sure. And I think that's come through because of so many truths of science coming through with so many facts that we're kind of forced into certain worldviews just as a result of our collective knowledge. So,
you're forced into a certain vocabulary because that's the one accessible to you.
Sure.
And so you fall back on the idea of rationality, which is not a scientific concept.
But of all the available options of thought.
But I do think in some ways you run the risk of falling similarly into the arrogance of rationality that most classical systems of knowledge eventually fell into, which is that rationality turned their conclusions into absolute truths. Right. And that is actually inimical to the basic values of scientific
right, but that's what I'm saying.
Pursuit.
Codified into the scientific method is none of these are truths.
I know, but what I'm suggesting is
true.
that science is not, it's not immune to falling into traps that others who presume the rationality of their system have fallen
Sure,
into.
but let me
That's
make
all
my
I'm
case
saying.
of why Thomas Kuhn is wrong.
Okay.
So, of everything pre-age of information, we seem to have this continual cycle that repeats itself constantly. But post the age of information, we're kind of going into this rapid advance. And so what are all noticing of the younger generations that are coming up through PhD studies when they go to do their dissertations and they're saying, okay, you got to stick in this field and you got to go through this paradigm. We're all going, no, wait, like, we have all learned already that you have to take holistic approaches and take from multiple sources and bring them together and find out if they're true in all of these situations. But the scientific method has brought that line of thinking about to bring the technology that has expanded the worldview, to make us empathize and break out of tribal mentality, to create a different future that I think is really different from what the old thinking could have envisioned.
I think you might be writing or linking together things into a narrative of progress that is arbitrary, and it's not clear to me that that demonstrates that Kuhn is wrong. That knowledge isn't paradigmatic, because I think in some ways what you're articulating when you said this is like the NFL pre-salary cap post, right? That was the analogy. Is that it's a different paradigm. So you can't really judge the one to the other. And what was possible in the one is very different than what might be possible in the other. So you might be right that the information age maybe breaks us out of this habit. That could very possibly be. But we're at an infinitesimally early stage. We have, like you said, we've already seen just in our lifetime how quickly this thing has we carry around technology that when we were kids was like movie shit.
Yeah, we've accepted chaos theory because of the age of information, where we have been in so much information, we have pretty much said scientifically, from an idea of how to handle human interactions in any way, shape, or form that is consistent, we almost put our hands up and go, no, there's so many variables. That's how we get to that point where we go, we can only do the best we can with the information we have available at that time. So the goal is to collect as much information.
I agree. But that's also why we have to be humble about the nature of our conclusions and therefore our recommendations for society. I don't say we don't fight for them, but we can't treat politics like a zero-sum game. We are not that important. That's my only point. Because we have to acknowledge that there are things we just don't know.
Right. But there are things that we do know.
We could be wrong. No, that's
confident
fine.
To say the drug war ending will reduce violent crime. You can be confident to know that.
That's fine. We can agree on those conclusions and that those are the outcomes we desire. the game of politics is to pull more people towards that conclusion. But that doesn't mean you can demand that they see things on the basis of your worldview. You just have to preserve space for dialogue.
Yeah,
but that space can't exist if we can't have the humility to accept that our position is that it's a perspective. It's not truth operating in the world.
I don't know. So the truth is that this is the best information we have at the time.
But
I'm not saying that.
And I'm not saying you're
Right.
wrong. What I'm saying is that what makes that a determinative value for you is a value system that has already sort of decided what sort of evidence you accept as valid, or what kind of, whether it's factual reasoning, whatever, what you accept as a valid perspective is determined by a value system.
I'm an atheist constructivist, and I'm going to be locked into that.
And other people don't share it. And
Right.
and if it's true that you are finite, that there is chaos and you don't know everything, it's possible you're wrong. And so on that basis alone, you cannot demand that they see it your way or adjudicate their conclusions on the basis of your value system. I just don't see from what position you can validly assert that. All you can hope is that both of you enter the space with enough humility to accept that you could be wrong, so you will hear the other person out. You will
Sure.
understand how their value system operates in order to reach those conclusions, and let it inform, or in some way, your own considerations. If you both enter that sphere, there might be some possibility of compromise or some solution.
Right. And
Because both of you might just have different information.
If you can get both of them into the scientific thinking, then they will both come in with that, because it's a necessary prerequisite of calling yourself a scientist.
But they don't want to call themselves scientists. The question is, what if their
Right,
sphere of
but-
knowledge is not invalid? It's just different information than what we've gathered. And what if solving these issues required both sets of knowledge?
But their argument seems to be predicated upon that there is no wrong. Like
No, our argument is predicated upon the idea that there is no wrong.
our argument is already based upon the
No.
accepted.
No. Our argument is predicated on the idea that we can be incorrect,
Right.
but there can be no moral wrong. There is no moral fault in our system.
Well, I
so that is.
I think we can have moral faults.
I know, but that is not. We know, right? When we think about policy, we always think about how the conditions inform the behaviors.
Right.
We
So
don't
what you're saying-
demand that the behaviors
They could
speak
think
for
it-
themselves.
Right. So you're saying
So
it
we're
could be
not operating in a moral sphere at that point. And the simple truth is, human beings, as much as and so one of the presumptions is that human beings react in a rational way, but for these conditions, they would not behave in such a manner. I think that is broadly true, but I also think we're an imperfect animal. And I do think that the moral sphere must be preserved in some measure, because there are always going to be some people who just aren't great people, right? And for against whom we have to be able to say some things are wrong, right? We're not going to say this was some societal cause. You don't get to do these things. They're too harmful. And so I don't think we're ever going to reach a point. If both sides insist that their values have to prevail, it's not going to work.
So you're saying, in the analogy, like, they think that allowing the drug use is so immoral that it would trump its empirical
Because
results?
of what they believe the consequences to the human animal. Of that,
Right.
they believe that their value of the dignity of the human animal does not justify even one instance, no matter the cost, of somebody falling into this.
But I don't think they actually believe that, because they'll drink their coffee every morning.
I'm not saying they've thought through all the terms, but the problem is that.
But if their argument's based upon a false premise,
I think you're, again, demanding that they adjudicate something that is about belief and faith on the basis of a rationality or a logic that just doesn't apply to that space.
I'm asking how we integrate their perspective if it's based upon empirical falsities.
Let me ask you this. Do you think ultimately in the broad history of the universe, it matters what conclusions we reach here on this planet.
No.
Okay, so in light of that fact, in light of the fact that it doesn't actually fucking matter, there's nowhere we're supposed
Matter
to
to who,
end
though?
up. But that's the point. One day there won't be any who's.
There's always who's
There's
at
always a
Whoville.
Whoville, right? So, in light of that, in light of that sobering knowledge, I think we have to be prepared to say that it doesn't have to go our way, and we can still be okay. I think we can push, but I don't think we can demand. I just don't see any justifiable vantage point from which I can assert that somebody has to sort of adhere to my value system.
I feel like I don't have a value system.
No, but you do. I mean, the entire. There's
but
no
of a
question that the
humanistic
scientific method. Yeah, but the question doesn't matter what the fundamental metaphysics are, because you're still basing your system on metaphysical categories. The what you talk about as rationality is still a metaphysical discourse, because that's not some thing we discovered in the brain. It's just the way we're accustomed to thinking about the superiority of human forms
it's
of
not
activity in the world.
I hear you, but
which has a theological inheritance.
But I don't take a position on what you should do.
Michael.
Michael.
Did you just say
yes, let me
that
explain.
you don't take a position?
Right. What I'm trying to say is that
Michael.
I don't,
Michael.
Stop. let me provide the nuance. Is that
provide the nuance, Michael?
I tell you what you should do if you want this desired thing. But I don't make a case that this should be your desired thing. What I'm trying to just say is that if you want a system, or you want your police, for instance, to use less uses of force, that these are things that we can do, and this with the best information we have at this time. I don't argue that you should have policing that brutalize you less. I actually don't make that argument.
But the people who want that outcome.
I would love to tell you how to get there.
But I think the issue you're having is with the people who don't want that outcome. Or who don't see...
I think they do want that outcome. They don't see that path, maybe?
No. They don't see the current situation as the way you describe it. That's a better way of saying it. It's not that they wouldn't agree that policing should be less abusive versus whatever level it is now. Yeah, I mean, who wouldn't broadly agree with that? But they might not see police as abusive.
Sure.
They might see that as necessary in light of XYZ.
Sure.
That's where the breakdown is. It's the values that are operating to make those things the sort of determining fact.
Yeah, but those are methods.
No, exactly.
So I don't think we disagree
They're different
largely.
methods based on different initial values. Not like a priori values. I think
that's what locks us in together, that I try to get white America in any typical sense to understand, is that I'm not making this argument for policing being bad or for cops being bad or anything. I'm trying to make an argument that if you want your police to treat your child with respect, we have to have a system that treats all the children with respect. That's just the way systems work.
Yeah, I mean, you're preaching to the choir with me.
But that's all I'm saying, is that's the way systems work. And if you want a system
that might be a good example of an argument that has a chance to reach them, right? But I think that chance is improved if, when they present your viewpoint, you don't demand on empiricism being the value upon which they adjudicate their conclusions. If you're willing to just accept their conclusions on the because you need to understand their value system.
Sure. So Avi and I have this argument a lot.
Okay.
And
he's the executive director of
the civilian-led policing
nonprofit.
To get my model
to make Mike's model a reality.
Right, a reality,
all
because
across America.
I pretty much am like, I do the same thing you can. Like, I can present this, but it's the citizens that have to fight for it. It's yours. You got to do it. I don't know what else I can do beyond this point. But we get into this argument over how to present these things, because do I compromise my at least perception of scientific integrity to empathize with a less educated perspective, or do I stick to my higher ground, or even a perception of a higher ground, and make them get to that position? And I don't know the answer to that, because it feels compromising when I allow the emotional plea to be the reason we end where we are, because the methodology of arriving at the outcome is poor.
I worry that this might sound elitist, and maybe it is, and I accept that criticism, but I think part of the problem is that some of what informs the fact that you have reached these conclusions and that you have this worldview is that you've had the advantage of an incredible amount of education relative what most people get. And so it's not that people don't have the capability to sort of, reach what you have, but many of them just haven't had the privileges up to this point in life and now no longer have the time, like they're too busy scraping by a living. So it could be that in sort of hoping everyone will get to your level, of understanding how this problem is, might be demanding something that's just not realistic in light of what the world has offered them. And so that might mean you're the one who has to sort of compromise and maybe not being so principled and maybe accepting some of the values that operate in their sphere, especially if you think it's those persons who probably mostly benefit. Because, I think the truth is, like, at a certain level of education, most people are kind of like not that directly impacted by policy, right? It's much more the working and poor people who get really, whose lives really get dictated by these things in a much greater way. It's not to say we're not at all impacted, but we're impacted less. Our social location.
That's a good point.
I think largely keeps us enwalled from a lot of the consequences of policy changes. And so in light of that, I think we have to be prepared to get off our high horse, to say that our values don't have to prevail, because frankly, they're from a space that most people just don't have never had a realistic opportunity of reaching. So what is the best way that we can, if we really think that these policies are helping people, it's not because they're helping us. We have to be honest. So, we always say we got to hear from oppressed communities. Well, are we going to hear from the people that our policies are supposedly going to, make their worlds better because they followed all the scientific evidence? I mean, we have to. The world is for them as much as it is for us, and there's more of them. Let's face it. Their values have to probably predominate in whatever is built.